Okay, everyone, I think I will kick us off. My name is Justin Reash. I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. I want to thank you all for joining us this Sunday, and I'm pleased to be hosting this panel lecture titled Historians of a New Generation. But before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you of three things. First, this panel is being recorded and it will be free to watch on our YouTube page in the coming days. Second, we will be taking questions from the audience in the last 15 minutes of this discussion. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'd like you to submit your questions and join in the conversation. Lastly, if you haven't done so yet, I highly encourage you to purchase the books written by our two guests. This panel explores their paths to becoming first-time authors, and there is no better way to show your support than to go purchase their books. You can find them on Amazon or at your local bookstore. So I really do hope you'll do so. So introducing our guests, our first is Tim Bouverie, whose book Appeasing Hitler, Chamberlain, Churchill, and the Road to War was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, and it was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. Good evening from your neck of the woods, Tim.
Good evening, Justin.
And our other guest is Catherine Grace Katz, who has taken time out of what some would say is a pretty hectic, busy schedule during her second year of law school to write the new and incredible book titled The Daughters of Yalta. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so to begin, I'd like to ask the authors a simple question, though probably isn't so simple in the answer. And I'll start with you, Tim. In one phrase, please describe the experience of writing your first book.
Daunting, and the process of it I would describe as Sisyphon, as in like Sisyphus, the character from Greek mythology who had to roll the stone up to the top of the mountain only to watch it roll back down, getting up each day, having finally got to somewhere approximately near my word limit of not terribly ambitious, of somewhere over 500 words, and then thinking that I had to begin it all again and possibly spend the first hour deleting those 500 words from yesterday. It definitely felt like that.
Well, that's an incredible response. And Catherine?
I'm going to go with the, if you're going through hell, keep going, because the joy of writing and telling the story certainly outweighs the frustration of the process along the way.
Well, we'll get into later about the process of writing and researching and publishing, but for any young people out there who are looking to be an author, I'm sure these two will tell you the joys as much as the frustrations here shortly. But Tim, let's start with discussing very briefly, your book takes us to 1938 and 1939 into the heart of the appeasement crisis. Can you please tell us a little bit more about this story in your book?
Sure. So I don't know quite how, I was always very impressed when I first began just Googling how much I thought Americans might have known about British politics, because there's no reason why you should, particularly pre the Second World War. But it seems that actually Neville Chamberlain made quite a big impact in the cultural United States, in the sense that when I first thought of this book, Barack Obama was trying to pass his deal for some form of agreement with Iran, and the Republican Party, or elements of the Republican Party, were comparing Barack Obama to Neville Chamberlain and were superimposing his head on the body of Neville Chamberlain, waving his famous piece of paper. So, but on the off chance that you are less familiar with Chamberlain, my book is trying to look at the process of how the British dealt with Nazi Germany right from the very beginning, right from 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, through to the moment when Churchill defeated Lord Halifax in the War Cabinet over the question of whether or not Britain should explore peace terms with Nazi Germany in June 1944, because that bookends this entire discussion of whether or not some sort of accommodation could have ever been made with Nazi Germany. Thereafter, Britain was in it either to be defeated or to be victorious. But the torturous question of whether or not to negotiate with Germany, how to negotiate with Germany, how to try and understand a man like Adolf Hitler, and what it was that his intentions were, is what I was focusing on. Apologies for the telephone running.
No, you seem like a busy man, so we thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us. But thank you for that description. And again, I highly encourage everyone to purchase Tim's book. I do know that you are probably working on another, so we greatly look forward to reading that. Catherine, like Tim just talked about, we start with 3839. Let's go on the theme of bookends. Your book takes us to early 1945 to Yalta on the Crimea. Tell us more about this story that you've written.
Yeah, so I started formulating the story right when we were coming off of the 2016 election, at which time the children of the presidential candidates were more involved and present in their parents' campaigns than at any other time in history. And so this book, as mentioned, takes place in early 1945, February 1945, at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea, where Churchill, FDR, and Stalin have met for what will end up being the last time, though they don't yet know it, to begin to lay the plans for peace in post-war Europe, things like the status of Germany after the war, Polish sovereignty, potentially bringing the Soviets into the war in the Pacific, and the formation of the United Nations. But what few people realized was at the conference, Churchill, FDR, and the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averil Harriman, all brought their daughters with them to serve as their aides at the conference. And each of the daughters brought unique skills and experiences that made them incredibly valuable to their fathers in this environment. And it was a story that few people realize, despite the fact that Yalta is taught regularly in history curriculum. And I certainly had learned about it many times in school, but had no idea that the daughters were there until I had the opportunity to write this book. And so it is a story about the Yalta Conference, but more than anything, it's a story about the relationships between these fathers and daughters, which I think are incredibly important, but relationships that we have not properly understood or valued until now.
Thank you. And I would agree with you. I think obviously not properly understanding, but yeah, valuing their point of view, but also not just their point of view, but their role, obviously, from reading your book. And again, everyone, please do so. The incredible role that they played, you know, not only individually between their parents, but you know, specifically with Anna Harriman, the Kathy Harriman, who, you know, basically prepared the conference from the American point of view. So we'll touch more on both of your books later in our conversation, but I want to begin, or I want to move forward with talking about you both as first-time authors. You know, as historians of I would say the current generation, you both are. I'm going to start with you, Catherine. What inspired you to write your book? And can you tell us, you know, what you were doing before becoming a historian?
Sure. So I've always loved history. I cannot remember a time in my life when I didn't. My favorite movies as a kid were things like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape. And I was always reading stories about history like Little House on the Prairie. And I think from the time I was really young, I knew that I wanted to write and that history was what I was always most intrigued by. And so I studied history at Harvard as an undergraduate and wrote my thesis on British prisoner of war escape narratives, with Churchill's escape from the Boer War and his account of his escape kind of being the initial text in this theme. And so I spent a lot of time with Churchill as a young man that year. And then after that, I went to Cambridge, where I did my MPhil at Christ's College with David Reynolds, looking at the origins of modern counterintelligence practices as they emerged under Churchill's leadership as Home Secretary during World War I. So I had somewhat coincidentally spent a lot of time with Churchill, however, not during the Second World War, as most people spend most of their time. And then at the end of my time in Cambridge, I decided I should do what I thought was the smart thing, like many recent graduates, and I went to New York to work in finance, where I was an alternatives investment analyst. But very fortuitously, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, named after Churchill's country home, which specializes in books by and about Churchill. And I used to go down there whenever I needed a break from Excel modeling. I'd say I was going to get a coffee, but I was really just going into the bookstore. And I got to know the owner, and he very kindly introduced me to the International Churchill Society. And at a dinner they were hosting with Madeleine Albright across the street from my office, I got to know also members of the Churchill family. And it was shortly thereafter that they were opening the papers of Sarah, Winston's middle daughter, to outside researchers for the first time. And ICS asked if I was interested in writing an article about them for the magazine Finest Hour. And of course I said yes. But I was especially excited to do this, not just because I wanted to return to history, but also because I had had this childhood kind of like passing experience with Sarah Churchill in a way. My family goes to the cloister in Sea Island, Georgia every year for vacation, and we've gone there since I was a baby. And on the wall of, in the lobby, there is this beautiful picture of Sarah on her wedding day, because she had eloped there with her second husband in 1949. And so I just kind of felt this, immediate connection to the project. And the more I learned about her and her experience, especially during World War II, I was fascinated by her life, and especially her role at her father's side as his aide at Tehran and also Yalta, where the other two daughters also joined her. Meanwhile, I was also applying to law school and decided to wait for 2 years to finish writing the book almost, and then finished writing it during my first year of law school.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And that's a great shout out to Barry Singer, proprietor of Chartwell Books, a great friend of the Society for a very long time, and quite jealous that you had that at the bottom of your office building. Tim, this is from knowing your biography a little bit. Writing this book is not the first time you've been paid to write something, or you have written something for publication. You were a journalist. Tell us a little bit about your path to writing your book.
Sure. Well, my path and indeed my CV is an awful lot less impressive than Catherine's. I have only 1 degree to her 10. But I similarly to her, I've always loved history, and I've grown up around it. I went to a fairly historic school in the southwest of England, Salisbury Cathedral School, in the close of Salisbury, where Anthony Trollope's The Warden is set. Being taught history in medieval buildings is a very good inspiration for young children. And then I studied history at university at Oxford, where I didn't actually do very much 20th century history at all. I mainly studied 18th and 19th century British and European history. And then I, after a while, became a journalist. But my major focus was British politics. And I went around Britain during both 2 general elections, the 2015 and the 2017 general election, as a television journalist. And then I also did the same sort of tours all around the country for the referendum on Scottish independence, and finally the referendum which led to the vote for Britain to leave the European Union. And a part of this, just for pleasure, is I was reading a lot of diaries of politicians who had been around in the 30s. The 30s, I think, the 1930s was certainly in Britain the great era of diarists, and anyone who wants to really know about what it was like and also be entertained by what political life was like, I can't recommend these books more highly. The Chips Channon diaries, the Harold Nicholson diaries, and the Duff Cooper diaries. They really do read like Evelyn Waugh novels. And I was reading the diaries of Harold Nicholson, who at one stage writes about coming across 3 English members of the aristocracy in May 1938. So this is 2 months after Hitler had invaded Austria, and only 18 months before the outbreak of the Second World War. And he comes across these 3 young lords in a club in central London, and they admit to him that they would far rather see Hitler in London, Hitler having invaded Britain, than a Labour or what they call a socialist government. And this just seems such a striking, amazing statement, which I hadn't come across before. And these books were filled with them, that I wanted to try and get an understanding of what the British had felt about the dangers of Nazism and what they had done to counter it prior to Churchill's accession to the premiership.
Yeah, and I will remark that on your point about the diaries, I believe it's your introduction or the very first part of your first chapter. You talk about Duff Cooper, was it leaving the Savoy Hotel and getting into almost a physical argument with whether it be his driver or someone he was with at dinner, discussing that desire for Hitler or someone not Labour or socialist to come to.
Yeah, much more than his driver. It was the Duke of Westminster, the most landed and richest aristocrat in Britain, who gave Duff Cooper a lift. And this was after Hitler had begun the invasion of Poland, but there was this 3-day hiatus between the German invasion of Poland and Britain declaring war. And people like Duff Cooper, who were very anti-appeasement, were very concerned that Britain wasn't going to honor its pledge to Poland and enter the war. And so you can understand his reaction when he gets into this car with the Duke of Westminster, and the Duke of Westminster says how marvelous it is that Britain hasn't yet declared war, because we are, after all, secretly Hitler's best friends, and the only people who want a war anyway are the Jews, and the Jews are our enemies anyway. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, but a few people did think like that then.
That's interesting that, and I will move on here shortly, but discussing diaries, I mean, from my point of view, and this is just one person's point of view, I don't think diary entry and keeping a diary, at least personally writing it down, is something that, you know, this generation does. Of course, the stories, personal stories, are told, and memories are you know, experienced through social media and in digital, you know, digital ways, but they really are a snapshot in time, those diaries, and it's incredible that they can continue to, you know, inspire people like yourself, and of course with Catherine to write. I will now move towards, let's talk about some challenges of conceptualizing, researching, writing, publishing this book, your books. If I can start, Tim, I'll start with you. You know, how can you think of some individual challenges that you'd like to speak to, and how you overcame them, and if you had any advice for a young person who wanted to make the leap into being an author, what would it be in terms of that process?
Well, just to pick up on the challenges, but I think it does, my answer does answer the second part of your question as well. The Munich Agreement and the policy of appeasement is something which almost anyone who's vaguely well informed has heard of, knows a bit about. And I had an awful lot of people say to me when I said that I was working on this book, oh, hasn't too much been written about that already? Isn't that very well known? And if you ever challenged somebody, though, to say, well, could you name a book that's come out in the last 30 years that does what I'm trying to do, that they might struggle. But it's very difficult. And Catherine and I imagine had this too, but we're writing on subjects which are well-trodden ground, and coming up with both a unique way of approaching them and something new to say about them is a challenge. And I think it's fantastic that Catherine has found a unique way of getting into the story of Yalta through the daughters of these great statesmen. One of my ways of deciding that there was something to write, and even before I'd gone to the archives and knew that there was any new material, although I suspected there would be new material, I couldn't be certain. But even without new material, I thought there were so many extremely good published diaries, so many fantastic diplomatic dispatches, newspaper reportage, that a narrative could be put together which made you feel like you were the reader were experiencing it at events as contemporaries experienced them. Mm-hmm. You're experiencing things day by day, that you started to ask yourself the question which I asked myself at the only time I ever formally studied this period, when I was 16 years old doing my school exams then, which is, what would I have done if I was Neville Chamberlain? And having the information pouring into Downing Street about what the German army is doing, about how many, or rather how few, Spitfires the British have at this time, what parliamentary and public opinion is at that time, I thought that this would be a different approach. And then the advice I would give, I mean, you're incredibly lucky if you can both pick a subject which is going to be popular in bookshops, and also you're going to come across a huge cachet of new papers which no historian has seen. I mean, I came across some new things, I know Catherine did as well, but the idea that you're going to probably find a smoking gun which is going to totally revolutionize our idea of the lead up to the Second World War or Yalta is you're probably unlikely to do that. So having a different approach and a different interpretation which comes from that approach is the advice I would give.
Catherine, before I move to you, I think one comment I have in response to Tim, and maybe Catherine, you can speak to this as well, is, and I see a question here in the Q&A from Roger, who says, excuse me, is there anything really new to say about appeasement, well-studied project? And I think the comment answer that I have, and Catherine, please reply, and then maybe Tim, sorry, is that of course, we are looking at, historians look at things that have happened in the past. There are no changing what has happened. And this is a very macro level view, so excuse me for being so simple about it. But as society changes, as values change, as nation states change, as socioeconomic situations change, I think there's great value in revisiting what has happened, in providing a new perspective on it. And also for people who are in a certain generation, if someone like Tim Bouverie, who they followed on the news, writes a book, that's an entryway into history that they may not previously had. So that's just an offhand reply. Catherine, tell us about your experience and also any replies you have to Tim's comments.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, there is a lot that's been written about Yalta before, almost entirely though from a very heavily academic perspective. But it didn't stop someone from writing me just saying, oh, another book about Yalta. To which I would reply, I think that there's no more important time than to study Yalta than right now. But I was the beneficiary of two huge new source kind of collections that became available. First, there are Churchill's papers, and then through the Churchill family, I was able to connect with Kathleen Harriman's family, and her sons also had her papers in their private collection. Just she had passed away in 2011. And really never spoke about the war during her life, because she felt like so many members of the greatest generation that what she had done was no more important than anyone else, and she was just doing her bit. But when she passed away, her sons discovered a huge box of letters she'd written to her sister from her time first in London, where she was working as a war reporter at just 23, 24 years old, while her father was a Lend-Lease envoy, and they became very close friends with the Churchill family. And then when she followed him to Moscow and essentially became his assistant ambassador, learned to speak Russian and had more access to Stalin in his inner circle than any other American woman in history. And so the character and the figure of Kathleen Harriman also was very new for people. She was a fascinating individual, but has really kind of been hidden behind the affair between Averil Harriman and Pamela Churchill, Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law. And so I'm really glad to give Kathleen a chance to speak for herself and show her very important role especially in Moscow during this period. But also what I came to realize as I was doing the research for this book, what helps working with a subject where there has been a huge amount written already. I mean, you could never read all of the secondary sources that has been written about Churchill, about FDR, about World War II. But by focusing very narrowly on one very dramatic week in world history, especially one where there are so many great diarists and letters being written, where there are wonderful details, and it does take on a very personal view, which I don't think was really possible to share before because these sources were not yet available. But I also discovered that in some of the more academic sorts of books where the daughters are occasionally mentioned in an offhand way to kind of add a bit of background color or lightheartedness, that there were many mistakes that had been made about them, just kind of whether through careless research or just the fact that there wasn't a lot known about them because their papers weren't available. And so I think that I also wanted to make sure that while I was writing this, that I told it as much from the daughter's perspective as possible, because through their eyes, you get a very different view. And I do think, when you're studying history, even the well-trodden paths of history, the times in which you're living can enlighten different aspects of it or make you ask different questions that you may not have previously considered. And I think that also, but what I see is my job as a historian is not only telling a story and telling it as accurately as possible, but I also really want to encourage people who previously felt that history, especially these great summits of history that felt very out of touch and out of reach for them, where they maybe felt too intimidated and didn't want to really begin to try to understand, because you've got these great men of history that we put on a pedestal, and we don't know, I couldn't know what it's like to sit across the table from Stalin and negotiate with him. But the relationship between a parent and child is something that we can all understand. So whether you're a longtime World War II Churchill FDR person, or you recently watched something like even The Crown and you were a little bit more interested in this period than you were before, I wanted to show people that this is history that you can understand, because fundamentally history is about relationships between people, about relationships between nations. And that more personal aspect is something that I think can give people the confidence to be able to understand the kind of history that Tim and I work in.
I think that's you really touch on some great points. One comment I have is your discussion on how focusing on newer perspectives or newer characters. Maybe you're right. Sarah Churchill was not prime minister. Her father was, but she was there when, one of my favorite parts of your book, amongst many, you described the trip from the airfield where they landed, driving a couple hours to Yalta, and they stop halfway at this house that the Soviets had prepared this huge feast that, that in hospitality, you would think that everyone would stop and eat, and FDR, due to his poor health and his poor stomach, refuses to eat and wants to move on. But Sarah and Winston Churchill have this massive feast together. And it's those like small vignettes that really allow people to connect with, you're right, a greater sense of history and greater events. So yeah, I just want to comment that using those new perspectives in those new diaries, or maybe if it previously published, you're using them to highlight the greater mosaic and arc of a story.
I completely agree with what you just said, Catherine, and Justin. The general advice for other people writing about any period of history is don't ignore the slightly less obvious characters, particularly their archives, because for one thing, if you're looking at the period that Catherine and I have been writing about, they were sometimes less busy, so they had more time to write diaries and letters. Winston Churchill did not keep a diary and didn't have time, nor did President Roosevelt. They're observers. They're great observers, and they've often been overlooked. The other thing which I've discovered, I discovered with my first book one thing, and I've only discovered working on my second book now, something which I wish I'd known before, is the first thing which I had discovered previously was that important people who may not be connected with your story may nevertheless hold papers relevant to them, because they are the holders of letters that people sent. So if I was looking at my book and I spent quite a bit of time in the archives of various British aristocrats who held no political power whatsoever, no ministerial office, no ambassadorial office, and don't appear in any other books about appeasement or Munich or anything like that. But because they are senior members of the British social hierarchy, when they write to the Prime Minister, as opposed to the greengrocer down the street, the Prime Minister replies. And that's where I came across new letters from both Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. The thing I wish I had thought of or had time to do for my first book, which I've only recently discovered, is you shouldn't just stop reading a diary or somebody's papers when your period stops. I mean, when do you stop doing research? When have you read enough to put pen to paper is the age-old question. And eventually, as Catherine says, you've got to draw a line, because you cannot read everything. You cannot visit every archive, and you cannot read every book. But in researching a book now, which is about the actual war itself, and reading many of the same sorts of sources, or indeed the same diaries, but a later period, the period 1939 to 1945, people wrote in their diaries reminiscences of the previous years, or they've come across someone and they will write, had a great lunch with X. He told me this wonderful story that in 1938, when Neville Chamberlain, he was terribly airsick on the flight to Munich, whatever it might be. And so I've created even more work for myself, I feel now, because I don't, even though my next book will finish chronologically in 1945, I've been carrying on reading diaries of people beyond that date on the off chance that there's a mention of something that has happened during the war.
Absolutely.
Catherine, go ahead.
One other thing on that. So when I started writing this, I actually set out to write a completely different book than what I ended up writing. I thought I was going to write a biography of Sarah Churchill and had written an entire proposal for it first. And so I think that letting the primary sources guide you, and you not trying to fit the primary sources into your preconceived idea of what the story is really important to allow yourself to be mentally flexible, to incorporate the things that you discover that you weren't anticipating, I think is really important. But also Tim's point about the more minor figures, or the kind of the fly on the wall perspective. So sometimes their role there can even be to, to be the person who records those details that the principal doesn't have time to take down. So one of Sarah's jobs, not only, kind of being the counselor and confidant for Winston, and also being a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And she was very familiar with the military developments of the war and intelligence from her experience in her work. But also Winston and Clementine Churchill decided very early in the war that someone from the family should always travel with him, because they knew that he would write his memoirs after the war, and he couldn't record everything himself. And so they wanted, a trusted party to be there, kind of also taking in all of the information about everything that was going on around him. And so Sarah is there also kind of with a deliberate eye towards history. And I see her in a way as also the conscience of the conference, because of what her perspective is and how, she feels things very deeply, very much like her father. And so it is kind of an extension of him seeing the world through her eyes. And then figures like Pamela Churchill, who's not there, but there are 3 people who are having affairs with Pamela who are at Yalta, and they're all writing letters to try to show off and impress her. And so we have these enormous 30-page letters from people like Peter Portal, who was the head of the RAF, and just the colorful details that are coming out of someone like him. He ended up being one of the biggest figures in the story because of the kinds of things he would notice, and the type of personality that he had that enlightens what you think of as kind of very dry diplomatic history in a completely personal way. And so allow yourself to be surprised by those moments, and to think about the figures who are not the main principal actors, who maybe had a little bit more time and certainly had different reasons for recording what they did.
So we have many questions, so I want to thank everyone for submitting them, and just to try to get to a few of them in our allotted time. One question, this is from David Guild. He asked, could Tim and Catherine each tell of one surprising fact that they unearthed during their research? I know it's hard. You guys do immense amounts of research, but if there's any small anecdote that stuck out into your mind, I think people would love to hear it. I don't mean to put you on the spot either, but we can always come back. We can always come back.
There were lots, but the only one that's springing to mind at the moment, was how senior members of the British foreign policy making establishment, senior British diplomats, and including the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, who then went on to become Britain's ambassador to Washington during the Second World War, how they had failed to read Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography come political treatise. I just find this completely astonishing. There was one man whose thoughts they were obsessed with trying to predict, trying to analyze, one man who was threatening their way of life and the peace of the world. He only wrote one book. You think that they might read it, but Catherine and I, I'm sure, both have a sympathy with people not reading your books, and maybe that's one of the only things that we have in common with old Adolf.
I think for me the most surprising thing was FDR appeared very differently for me after I completed the research for the book compared to the beginning. You think of FDR as being an incredibly progressive person, and in many ways he was, but not necessarily in relationship to his own family, and especially his own daughter. His daughter Anna had wanted to travel with him and to be the important person at his side for years, and his sons had been able to travel with him to previous overseas meetings, largely as physical supporters to help him stand because he was paralyzed. But Anna, she was really kind of shut out by him when she, from the time she was, a teenager on, and she's always trying to recover this close relationship that she had remembered having with her father as a little girl, which really changed after his paralysis. And so I think FDR is a much more personally complicated figure than we might think. And you can really see this in his relationship with his daughter, which is not always as progressive as you think that it might be. And oddly, Churchill is kind of, and Harriman are much more progressive than FDR in many cases in the treatment of the women in their lives and their daughters. But I also think that FDR's foreign policy is something that he's a fantastic domestic politician, and he of course had many brilliant contributions to winning the war, especially Lend-Lease. But by 1945, I think there's a little bit more critical eye that we can look at his foreign policy with, and especially kind of reading the correspondence between people like Chip Bolin and George Kennan, who became wise men of the Cold War, and they were writing to each other at this time. And so I think that FDR, of course, did many wonderful things, and I don't want to discount that at all, but I think he is a more complicated person than many people assume, especially in his personal life.
I would like to say that that is an incredibly important comment you made, and something that struck me as both Tim and Catherine know. I have a young daughter, and I have really enjoyed writing this or reading this book due to my own new and growing relationship with my own daughter. I think you're completely correct. The difference in, I don't want to call them parenting styles, because these are adults, but the way that the relationships that these three very powerful, busy, significant people had with their daughters are completely different. And it's a fascinating part of the book. So thank you. Thanks for bringing this up and for writing about those relationships. I'd like to move on to, this panel is titled Historians of a New Generation. That was my title, and I'm not claiming credit for it in the sense, I don't bring it up to claim credit, but I bring it up to say that what I was so greatly looking forward to speaking with you both is I feel we are all relatively part of the same generation. When I say relatively, we all are of the same generation. And I want to talk about the current crises that are going on throughout the world in our society, and how. So my question starts with Tim. The question is, in this divisive society currently, how can historians, whose traditional role is to gather facts, gather evidence, do research, and then to interpret after that, how can historians, what role can they play in our current society and really fight against what I would call a short-termism, in the sense of interpreting first and finding facts and doing research second?
Well, I think they should and do point out when people are making wildly inaccurate statements, whether it be the senator whose name has just escaped me, who in the last couple of days, a Republican senator claims that the Second World War was fought against the forces of socialism in Europe, or whether it be people who are putting on, claiming entirely ahistorical trends with relation to race or imperialism, or whatever it might be. And I think that the current crisis has been good in some ways for history. It's been very bad for the world, very bad for politics, but the rise of populism in both the United States and Europe has caused a lot of historians to put down tools and write slightly more theoretical books. Timothy Snyder's written very good books on tyranny and the loss of freedom. And I think historians have a role to play, and but they also have to stand up for complexity. And the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in America, has very much moved over to Britain as well. And this is an event founded by the International Churchill Society. Winston Churchill's statue outside Parliament had to be protected by police after people had scrawled graffiti called Churchill a racist on it. And I think it's the historian's duty to point out that, yes, by normal today's standards, of course, Churchill's views on race are nowhere near where they are now, but nor were anyone else's. Equally, his views on anything that really we have today, I mean, not anything, but a lot of things he did, was his views on a woman's role in politics, or on feminism, on welfare, on poverty. A lot of these things aren't the values that we would have now. Does not mean to say that he's not also the man that can be attributed with saving Britain and arguably Europe from a far worse racist tyranny. So I think historians have to, and academics in general, have to stand up against populists. Populists always simplify things. Our job is to point out the nuances when we can.
Yeah. Nuance is
Catherine,
exactly the
please.
word I was going to use. Yeah, the not allowing nuance to be swept aside is incredibly important, and oftentimes people don't have the patience to listen to the nuance. I think that we've made great strides in STEM related fields in the last decade, and this is an incredibly important part of education, but I don't think it should be at the expense of history and the humanities either. And I think that kind of the tools of discourse and rhetoric and understanding of the human condition, which you can really glean from history, have unfortunately been sacrificed at times. And I think through reading and writing, especially history, you understand the story of what makes us human and how people have interacted with each other and what's the same and what's different about that as time goes on. I think also historians have an obligation to move with the times, not in the sense of writing about what's in vogue, but adapting to means of communication. Not at all saying that people shouldn't write book length history. I mean, that is what I do, and so I don't want to put myself out of a job. But there are also, in addition to that, many storytelling mediums that have emerged that I think historians should embrace, and ways of connecting with different audiences that may not have realized that they're interested in history. For example, podcasts. I think that's a terrific storytelling format, and one that people who maybe don't think that they are interested in reading a history book might be more interested kind of in that, engaging in that medium. And once they realize they actually enjoy a great story from history, then they are more excited to turn to more traditional forms of storytelling. So I think it's also on us to figure out how to communicate with people and draw them in. And there are exciting opportunities to do that. But I also think that you can put forth ideas that may not necessarily be in vogue, or people may kind of have a gut reaction against, in telling a story from history that, because it is somewhat controversial. I think the controversial things are the ones that are often most needing exploration, and a real engagement with primary source material, not just citing to a newspaper article which cited to another newspaper article and another newspaper article, but actually going back to the original source. And because there is a bristling effect when you come up against those kinds of topics, I think that those are the ones that we really should be looking into and should be writing about and thinking about critically, and not just kind of writing them off as all bad or all good, because this is, again, where nuance comes into play.
I think your point about new technology and story ways of telling stories is so important. At the NCLC at GW, we're trying to figure out how can we incorporate digital humanities into what we offer. And of course, GW is closed for this semester, or closed for next semester due to COVID, and we won't be able to kick on with that. But I think it's imperative for historians and historical organizations like ICS to meet generations as much as possible where they operate, and to really try to get on their level, because we're bombarded with every single different type of technology now that our attention span is very short, but always pushing nuance. I mean, Tim, I think it's okay to say that when most people who haven't read your book, who don't really know much about Neville Chamberlain, the first thing they say is, oh, appeasement. He was an appeaser. Like he chose Hitler over the UK, and of course that's not true. And I think what a great thing that your book does, I started feeling quite. I felt for Neville. I felt for the impossible situation that he was put into, and I felt for his rather what is now deemed not the best point of view, but of that sense of taking accountability and responsibility of trying to make peace, because he cared about his countrymen. I mean, so that's what I think is important with what you guys do, is being able to provide that nuance and to change perspectives, because perspectives, as we know, change as people change. I would like to get into a lot of these very interesting questions. Tim, the first one is for you. This is from Stanley. The paper that Chamberlain waved when he claimed peace in our time, where does it exist now?
Stanley, that's a very, very good question. I believe that it exists in the National Archives at the UK National Archives at Kew. Although I have to admit, based on my hesitation, that I haven't seen the original paper. I've seen the various copies of it, but the actual ink one with the signatures, I haven't seen. So I think it is at Kew. If it's not at Kew, it will be, or it should be, in Chamberlain's papers at the University of Birmingham.
Catherine, this question is from Jay. In the intro of your book, you mentioned how poor the facilities at Yalta were. Why do you think the Russians were so ill prepared to host such an important conference? And how important was it for Stalin in sorry, first question, why do you think that Russians were so ill prepared to host such an important conference, and why was it important for Stalin to host this conference in Russia?
I'm going to start with the second question. So at this point in the war, the Battle of the Bulge has just ended. We have not yet had Iwo Jima. We don't know if the atomic bomb is going to be a success. The Red Army has boots on the ground across Eastern Europe, and it's just now finally beginning to look like they will reach Berlin by spring. And the race is on to figure out who will be the first to liberate Berlin. And so by this time in the war, the balance of power has really shifted in Stalin's favor, and unfortunately against Churchill. And FDR is looking at the post-war world and recognizing that there is a bridge that needs to be built with Stalin to maintain this relationship after the common enemy of the Nazis has been defeated. And so both Churchill and FDR, I think they're in the position where they need Stalin to agree to their objectives more than Stalin needs them to agree to his. He's very afraid of leaving his security apparatus in the Soviet Union. The far west he's willing to travel is the Black Sea and the Crimea. And also, he says it's on the advice of his doctors, which is a bit laughable because as we know now, FDR was dying of congestive heart failure and would end up dying 8 weeks later after Yalta. And he has to make this journey thousands of miles across enemy occupied territory and in Atlantic Ocean where they're still sighting U-boats. Churchill has to fly from London. One of their planes carrying Foreign Office experts actually goes down on the way. One of the advanced planes gets shot at, but it just really goes to show how strongly they felt about meeting with Stalin personally and how much strength he had in the negotiating power at this time. And so that's the reason why they're willing to go all the way. And I think it is important to even just look at a map and visualize just how far it was that they had to go. So as I said, the Crimea is as far west as he's willing to go. And so there are not a lot of great options there to meet. The Tsar's summer palace on the Black Sea at Yalta is the best of many bad alternatives. And the Soviets really only have about 3 weeks from the time where they decide where they're going to have the meeting to turn around what had once been a beautiful palace, but has been completely devastated by the Nazis in their occupation of the Crimea, where they used Levadia Palace as their headquarters. And when they left, they stripped it of absolutely everything of value, even down to the doorknob. And so it's a Herculean effort that they make to take everything kind of from the luxury hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, which some of you might remember from Amor Towl's book, A Gentleman in Moscow. And so it's kind of this odd duality as well, the Soviets feeling strongly about being gracious, generous hosts, which they are in many ways, dealing with incredibly limited resources. They don't even have coat hangers or ashtrays, and they just have to requisition them out of the devastated local populations. And so, the sense of place there, it's kind of a bit, if you peek behind the curtain, it reveals just what a facade this is. And I feel like the setting and the physical place itself is as much of a character as is, any person in the story. Because the toll it took on each of them, just to get there is astounding. And it's not something that any world leader would agree to do today. Their security teams would never allow it. But I think it is really important thinking about where we are in the war, that they were willing to do it. But also kind of the duality of the Russians being so generous and gracious, and yet at the same time, the NKVD roaming the area looking for anybody who was potentially could be a security risk in their opinion, and the bugging and it's the duality of it, and the juxtaposition is entertaining but also frightening.
Tim, I have a dual question for you. The first question is from Sarah. It's a very simple one. She says, Tim, I have an ancient copy of a small paperback titled Appeasement, A Study in Political Decline, 33 to 39 by A.L. Rose, published in 1961. Are you familiar with this book?
I am. A.L. Rose was a Cornish historian who was at All Souls, Oxford. He was passionately opposed to appeasement, and All Souls, which is this unique college at Oxford in the United Kingdom, which is just for professors only. And it has as its fellows a lot of senior politicians, included very famous appeasers like Lord Halifax, I believe, Sir John Simon, who was the later Chancellor of the Exchequer and was Chancellor of the Exchequer then, and then became Lord Chancellor. And people later used to talk about the conversations that occurred at this, quote, disastrous dinner table, because it was believed that All Souls had an influence on the policy of appeasement. So yes, I'm familiar with it. It's entertaining from a certain perspective, but Rouse is coming at it as a partisan who stood as a anti-appeasement candidate in the 1930s for his native Cornwall.
The second part of this question is from Ewan in London. What kinds of connections were there between UK anti-appeasers and US interventionists in 39-40, if you know of any conversations or relationship?
That's a very good question, and something that I'm going to look into in my next book. The answer is that not overt ones. By the time Churchill comes into power, most of the anti-appeasers are now in the government. And although the British are absolutely desperate for the United States to enter the war and to give Britain all the support that she can, it is rightly, I believe, recognized that what would be far more disastrous than the worst thing that could happen would be for the United States to believe that Britain was somehow engaging in black ops, in propaganda, in trying to inveigle the United States into a foreign war. And the British ambassador at the beginning of the Second World War, Lord Lothian, just keeps on writing back saying, we are not doing propaganda here. We are not doing that. That said, there are certain things that the British are doing, but they are so paranoid about the Americans finding out that they're not even really doing it with much connection with Americans at this time. They're doing it and funneling it through neutrals and the press. The only person with whom there was probably a bit of contact before America entered the war was Colonel Donovan, who became the founder of what would later become known as the CIA under Roosevelt.
Oh, interesting. Catherine, this is from Stanley. To what degree, if any, did Roosevelt and Churchill press Stalin to get him to declare war on Japan? If you know that.
Yeah. So first, I just wanted to add one thing to what Tim was saying. Averell Harriman was actually one of the most outspoken advocates of American entry into the war, well before the rest of the country was in favor of that. And so he's definitely one who would have been extremely sympathetic to British interests, and that's why he was sent as the Lend-Lease envoy. So yes, the Soviet entry into the war in the Pacific is one of FDR's main objectives. As I mentioned, he doesn't yet know if the atomic bomb will be a success. So he's looking at the potential invasion of the home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. And his priority at this time is to save as many American lives as possible. Japan and the Soviet Union had a pact of neutrality throughout the war, and FDR wants to bring the Soviets into the war as soon as possible to minimize American casualties. And so he's willing to make territorial concessions in order to secure their participation. So they agree that they will join the war in the Pacific 3 months after the war in Europe ends, which they do, which really is only just 3 days before the war in the Pacific ends, because we do end up with the atomic bomb. And so they are able to secure territorial concessions, and which are quite strategic, with very little contribution. And unfortunately, kind of the noble desire to bring the Soviets in to save American lives, which that is very important to FDR, and of course should have been. There was some haste as well and lack of knowledge about history in the region in making some of those territorial deals with him. For example, the Kuril Islands, chain of islands off the northern tip of Japan, which had been a point of contention between Russia and Japan between 1904 and 1905 when they were at war. FDR agrees to give the Kuril Islands that Japan had supposedly taken from Russia at the time and give them back to the Soviets, when in fact several of these islands closest to Japan had never belonged to the Soviets. And it's for this reason, this failure to agree on what exactly constitutes the Kuril Islands, which of them did Roosevelt mean, how is that different in the Russian interpretation compared to the American interpretation, and this is the reason why technically 75 years later, Russia and Japan are still at war.
That's fascinating. We only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask this question and have both of you answer. This question's from Eugene. How important is it that political leaders themselves are historians? Winston Churchill was both, and this massively influenced his approach to the threat of totalitarianism in Europe in the 30s. Catherine, would you like to answer first, please?
Yes. I think if a president or prime minister isn't a historian by trade, they should certainly have a historically inclined mind and read lots of history. But I also think that there's a recalibration that we should make of the role of the historian. For example, in the American government, there's the office of the historian, attached to the White House, attached to Capitol Hill. But I think that there's actually room for the historian to play more of a policy role, not necessarily making policy, but advising on policy. And using a historical perspective, at least, to be part of the conversation when we're making decisions moving forward. So kind of this, applied history lens, which I think could be very powerful, not necessarily determinative in policy making, but certainly should be considered, especially if the leader himself or herself is not a historian per se.
I agree with all of that. I think that it's been quite a long time since there's been historian prime minister of Britain. One of the things that Tony Blair said after he left office was if he could have had a better training in one thing, it would have been in history. If he had, then he might have realized that launching large-scale invasion in the Middle East was a dangerous undertaking with the potential to destabilize the region. But also learning the right lessons from history. I mean, there's history, and then there are selective interpretations. And one of the slight dangers of this, going back to the earlier question about how can we understand history in this highly polarized age, is how some historians are themselves ideological warriors. And there have certainly been books, even on the period that Catherine and I are writing about, on Winston Churchill, which seek to paint him as in the clothes of a Brexiteer, despite the fact that he was one of the greatest advocates of the United States of Europe. Or you could have, I imagine, the United States, somebody writing any form of history which would go to support a Trumpian or a Democrat-led view of the world of that. And I think as historians, we need to call those people out as well. I mean, we all have our own personal political views and prejudices, but we have to try and isolate them as much as possible.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you both for your time, and thank you for your, your writing. It brings joy to many of us listening, and more who are not. Thanks so much. And for everyone who is on this call again was recorded. We'll be sharing it. I'll be sharing it with you once we upload it to our YouTube page. And don't forget to buy the books of the authors. So thanks so much, Tim and Catherine.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Justin.
Take care.